A lot of the time for these sessions, I draw from my imagination, or I finish off a piece that I had already planned out, probably from Inktober last year. For this session, though, I'm going to just draw some normal things. I'm going to work from some references. I planned on birds, but we ended up with mushrooms. There really wasn't any reason for this in particular. As I opened my iPad, which is what I usually use for my reference material, I had mushrooms pulled up, and the mushrooms were pulled up from some of the drawings that I've been doing for my podcast. So I just went with it. Most of my early drawing was like this, working from a picture. I don't think I realized until I was a bit older that one could work from life, which is odd, considering how much time I spent outside, having some awkward allergic reaction to basically everything. The doctor when I was young actually said I should live in a bubble because I was allergic to 96% of the things that they tested me for. For some reason, I never drew outside, though I spent most of my youth outside. It didn't occur to me to bring my sketchbook along and draw crawdads, lizards, or snakes that we pulled out of the rocks and rivers. But I drew inside. I drew from eyewitness books. I drew from magazines. I drew from things that I could find once the internet actually came out, which was early on in my drawing career, I suppose. I drew from manuals for video games, Command and Conquer, Donkey Kong, Mario, Mega Man, Super Metroid. I drew from things, and it took me a long time to realize that I could draw outside. And I still have some strange aversions to drawing from life, even though I know I have long avowed the benefits of doing so. There is just something inside me that wants to be comfortable when I paint and when I draw, even though being outside and dealing with shifting sunlight and the occasional bug is probably good for my soul. But today, we are working from reference. Who knows, maybe next session I'll go outside. I guess I could figure out a way to rig something for my recording, but let me know if you'd like to see that. See me fumble around on my back porch crying in the 30-mile-an-hour wind. But today, we're drawing mushrooms. And I think it's important sometimes to just draw things like this. I didn't have a plan. Of course, I looked up the mushrooms initially because they fit into something that I was working on. But for today, for this sketchbook session, the mushrooms are just mushrooms. They're just something to practice shading, something to practice contours, something to look at and understand what they are. I've been talking to some people recently about drawing from reference and why it's important and how to do it. These are interesting conversations, things that I had to do when I was working with the students in middle and high school, but something that I don't often think about from my own perspective or from a professional or an adult perspective. Part of the reason that we draw from references, I used to think, was just to make our drawings more accurate. I suppose this is still true, but in a different capacity, for a different reason, maybe. And it's the fact that when you draw from reference, you can choose to copy what you're drawing. You can just copy it exactly. You don't really understand anything about it. You just replicate the shapes. You replicate the shading. You replicate what you see. That doesn't really afford you much benefit except for getting a drawing that looks fairly accurate. And frankly, I'm not very interested in that. I'm interested in the other part of it, understanding what it is that I'm drawing. Now, there's two portions to this today with the mushrooms that I'm drawing. The first is rather obvious. I'm looking to understand what makes a mushroom look like a mushroom. They are, just like everything else, defined by a certain set of factors, a certain set of shapes, and how the light affects those surfaces. The materials, basically. But on the other side, a mushroom is also just a window into understanding the world around us, how to make things look three-dimensional. Really, when it comes to drawing or painting, most of what you're trying to do is create an illusion. You are creating a two-dimensional representation of something three-dimensional. And so fundamentally, you are a magician. You are trying to create something that isn't real, that is convincingly real. And that's kind of an interesting thing. It's kind of fun if you think about it in that capacity. It's an odd challenge. But that's what I'm doing with these mushrooms. I'm simultaneously trying to learn what makes a mushroom, and this is because the more you understand the world around you and different things, those skills transfer. Obviously, when I'm making a mushroom, that's going to transfer into drawing things like bread, things like trees, other natural things in life, other organic forms. But it's also going to tie in specifically to the stories that I'm trying to tell. A lot of the stuff in the podcast has involved drawings of mushrooms in deep underground caverns. So it's a direct application there. But also, I'm just learning more about how the world functions. I'm learning about how to shade things and how that works in our world. Now, that may just sound like a teacher who's trying to explain why you should do something that you've always been told to do. But ironically, I spent a lot of my art career hearing from people, and even for a portion of it telling other people, that they shouldn't draw from reference, that they should only draw from life. The reason for this is usually stated pretty simply, and it's the fact that when you take a picture of something, it's already a flat image and it's taken through a single ocular lens, whereas when you look at something with your eyes, you're seeing with two eyes at the same time. This creates depth, and we usually refer to this as depth perception, but it does change how things look. You know, if you go outside and you paint a grove of aspens from your own perspective without a photograph, it will look subtly different than if you take a photograph of the same thing. This might even be why sometimes when you take a photograph, colors aside, different things look differently when you look at the photograph versus when you look at the actual physical thing in reality. Some of that might be because of the way that the camera works, but I think some of it also comes from the fact that we don't look through a single thing. We look through two eyes most of the time. Unless you're missing an eye or you're blind in one eye or, you know, some other situation, in which case, I'm sorry. But I would imagine actually if you were blind in one eye or you only had one eye, that your drawings really would be pretty similar regardless of whether they were coming from reference or from real life. The difference though is that references also do a really poor job of capturing color. Our eyes seem to do a much, much better job at that. Someday that will probably switch. Someday it will probably flip. But I told a lot of people for a long time, and I was told for a long time, that you shouldn't draw from reference, that you should just draw from life. And that is just a lie. It is not true, categorically. You can draw from references, and you can draw from imagination, and you can draw from life. They are three fundamentally different things. My end goal is to be able to draw convincingly interesting, lifelike things from my imagination. In order to do that, I have to work from reference. That reference can be reality itself, or that reference can be images like I'm looking up right now with these mushrooms. But I have to work from life in some capacity in order to understand what life looks like. Otherwise, I will never be able to convincingly do that from imagination. And because that's my personal goal, that makes some sense. But even if your goal is primarily to work on cartoon things that are, you know, we have to go into the definition of cartoon. Like a cartoon just means a drawing of a thing. It's a simplified version of a thing. It's not a derogatory term. It doesn't mean that it's simple or childlike. It just means it's simplified. You know, in a lot of ways, it's an abstraction of reality. If you sit down to draw a fish and you make it look perfect, it is not a cartoon, it is not abstract, it is not simplified, it is just the fish. But you don't need to do that. With a couple lines, you could make something that is a symbol of a fish, and that's fine. So if you're gonna work more in that train of thought, you're gonna work on cartoons, like studying real life and studying references is still really beneficial. Obviously, when I put these mushrooms into my drawings, I'm not going to make them photorealistic because the characters that are in it are not going to be realistic. So I'm going to remove details, but in order to figure out which details I need, which details I can remove, I have to work from reference, whether that reference, again, is real life or it's just a photograph. So working from reference is going to be a beneficial thing. It's a good thing. For me, though, it's also just safe. References give me a little bit of a crutch. They give me something to cling to. It's harder to mess up when I'm drawing from reference, partly because I've done so much of it over my years, but also because the details that I need are there. I don't have to ask quite as many questions. I've drawn a lot of mushrooms from memory, and they're usually okay. Like, they're tolerable as a mushroom, but they're not great. If my endgame goal was to be a mushroom drawer, I would only be able to do that better past a certain level by working from references. Which is kind of an interesting thing in and of itself, because if you work without reference, if you work only from imagination, you can actually learn how to do things better, because you can draw a thing, notice that something's wrong, and fix just a single element, and then continue to move forward and do that again and again and again. It will work, but it is a really slow and arduous path, And if you don't happen to actually have the visual information somewhere in your memory, then you might only be able to progress so far. So references are just the best way to do that. I am trying to get better about looking up references when I do even my quick imagination drawings, because you learn so much from having a couple photos. Yesterday I was working on a drawing for the Discord weekly drawing challenge. It's not really a challenge, it's just their weekly prompts. And the one I chose was an alien trying desperately to fit in with normal humans. So I drew a businessman with a weird alien face and tentacles instead of hands. And that was the prompt that I wanted to do. I wanted to have him like typing on a computer like he's just trying to blend in at an office job. Instead of just working from my imagination, I did like the first initial sketch. Then I looked up a business suit, I looked up a hat, I looked up a couple different kinds of eyes, and I looked up a photograph of a laptop computer from that angle. And that helped me tremendously to get things laid out. There were things that I wouldn't have thought about. Certain wrinkles in the way that the cloth functioned, sure. The little strip of fabric on the hat. I didn't think about using a lion's eye until I was already looking up a goat's eye. So all these things that just kind of show up when you work from reference. And I've talked about this before, but I think that's one of the most beneficial things to working from reference is all of the other inclusions that you didn't plan on. I didn't plan on putting a pair of glasses on the table when I drew that, but it was there. I didn't plan on drawing mushrooms from this particular angle, for example, but I'm doing it because it's in the reference, and it kind of makes the mushroom feel a little bit more grounded. What am I learning from that? Well, I'm learning that the shadows and the light affect the ground a little bit differently, and I'm also learning that part of what makes a mushroom look like a mushroom is how it intersects the ground. Unlike trees, they don't have these roots that prop them up quite in the same way. They almost seem to go straight in. And that, of course, is because the mushrooms that we see are just the fruiting bodies of the plant. It's not a plant, sorry, the fungi. Most of the fungi lives beneath the surface of the ground or whatever material that it's utilizing. And so really, it is just plunging straight up. Kind of like aspen trees do frequently in Colorado, because most aspens are just shooters. They're coming up from roots underneath the ground, and so they do just pop straight up. They don't have a root system necessarily. The big ones will, but often the little ones that sneak their way out of your garden and start growing randomly around your house, those ones they don't really have their own root structure. So they pop just up like mushrooms. And actually, if you look at how they grow much more like a fungus than they do anything else. But all that to say, I didn't decide to draw mushrooms today. I just kind of came into some photographs of mushrooms and I worked from them. It was an enjoyable time, and I think that drawing from reference is something that I need to start reincorporating into just my general flow for how I'm making art. And I would encourage you to do the same. So please, in the comments below, let me know what you are working on right now artistically and the references that you like to find and you like to work from. As always, thank you for your time. If you would like to participate in our Discord server, we just built it a couple weeks ago, probably a month ago at this point. If you would like to look into that, you'd like to have some people you can work with, that you can chat with, you can work on some of the weekly prompts, check that out in the description down below. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.